Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and curious sides of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and on this episode we're going to discuss a 19th century Dubliner with a truly magnificent name, Dionysus Lardner. Though he might have been born in 1793 as plain Dennis Lardner, or he might have been christened Dionysus and just used Dennis for simplicity as a child. His father, William O'Brien Lardner, was a poet, so he might have decided to name his son after the Greek god. But he was only an amateur poet. By trade, he was a solicitor, a much more sensible breed of people. All we know is that Dionysus was a name he chose to use when he became an adult, so Dionysus is what we'll call him. When Dionysus was 14 years old, he began working at his father's law firm, but he hated it. After 5 years, he persuaded his parents to let him quit the firm and go to study at Trinity University. His time at university would be eventful both on and off the campus. By the time he received his bachelor's degree, aged 24 in 1817, he had been married for 2 years and had 2 children. His wife was named Cecilia Flood. She was related to Henry Flood, who had been both an MP and the Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. Dionysus and Cecilia named their son Henry, after a famous relative, and their daughter Cecilia. Third child died in infancy. Dionysus gained his master's degree in 1819. In order to take up a job at Trinity as a lecturer, he had to take holy orders in the Anglican Church. This was the rule at most universities at the time. How seriously he took his religious vows is shown by the scandal he got caught up in the following year. At the time, Dionysus was quite friendly with Anne Boursiquot, who was the sister of his fellow Trinity student George Darley. Darley went on to be a fixture of the London poetry scene in the 1820s, one of many who were always on the verge of striking it big but never did. Anne was separated from her husband Samuel, and Dionysus might have been separated from Cecilia at the time. One thing led to another, with the result that when Anne gave birth to a baby boy in 1820, her husband was officially listed as the father, but she named the child Dionysus. The boy grew up to be famous as the actor Dion Boucachaw, and we may speak more of him some other day. It's generally accepted that Dionysus was Dion's true father, and he did provide for the boy for the next 2 decades. Cecilia definitely believed this. At a dinner party in October of 1820, 2 months before the baby was born, she denounced her husband as an adulterer and left him for good. Dionysus wound up lodging with Anne, and their relationship would last longer than his first marriage. All of this scandal doesn't seem to have hurt his academic career. He won prizes for logic, metaphysics, ethics, mathematics, and physics. He also began to show his talent for science communication. He wrote for various magazines, and one of his essays about the geometry of solids became part of the standard textbook in schools at the time. He gave a series of lectures to the Royal Dublin Society about Charles Babbage's difference engine, and explained the new invention so well he was given a gold medal. In 1827 he earned a doctorate in law, and the same year he was offered a job as the first ever professor of natural philosophy and astronomy at London University. This was a brand new university, which would be renamed as University College London 10 years later. It was founded to provide a secular alternative to the very Anglican universities of Cambridge and Oxford. Dionysus would only stay there for a few years, but it did provide the impetus for him to move from Dublin to London. Anne Boursiquot and her son Dion came with him. His 2 children by Cecilia stayed behind in Dublin with her, and it's entirely possible that he never saw them again. Although Dionysus stayed as a professor at the university until 1831, he found his true calling in London as an early version of a media personality. The most notorious example of this was when he went on a speaking tour around England to promote Babbage's difference engine. Initially, this was going to be similar to the talk he did in Dublin, a technical overview of what the engine did and how. This plan changed for 2 reasons. Firstly, it was thought that his audience would be less technical than the RDS members. Secondly, the main purpose of this tour wasn't to educate the audience. It was to sell difference engines. So rather than talk about what the engine did, he spoke about what it could replace. the large volumes of pre-calculated mathematical tables that many industries used. Lardner spoke extensively about the danger of errors in these tables, and how the difference engine was more reliable because it actually did the calculations. While this was effective on the general public, experts tended to think the risk of errors is a lot less than he made it sound, and this contributed to the idea of the difference engine as gimmicky. It's also the first major example of Dionysus being willing to change his output to match whatever the person paying him wanted to hear. It would not be the last. What made Dionysus Lardner a household name in those years was his greatest project, the cabinet Cyclopedia. Encyclopedias were not a totally new concept at the time. The Encyclopedia Britannica, one of the most famous, had been in print for over 60 years, though at the time it was mostly seen as a Scottish publication. The market in England was still wide open, and Dionysus intended to take it over. He began work on it as soon as he arrived in London, and the first volume was published in December 1829. The Cyclopedia was organised by topic, and was divided into 5 parts, which Dionysus called cabinets: arts and manufactures, biography, history, natural history, and natural philosophy. Natural history meant biology as well as an overview of the animal and plant world. Natural philosophy meant science of all other kinds. Within the cabinets, the Cyclopedia was divided into volumes. For example, the history of Switzerland made up 1 volume in the history cabinet, while a volume in the biography cabinet might contain the lives of 6 different people. The history of England was naturally very in-depth and took 10 volumes to cover. Walter Scott was one of the earliest contributors, writing 2 volumes on the history of Scotland, with the first released in 1830. Thomas Moore, writer of the song The Minstrel Boy, wrote a 4-volume history of Ireland that was considered the highlight of the entire series. Mary Shelley was the only woman who wrote for the Cyclopedia. She wrote 5 volumes for the biography cabinet about European writers. Despite the talent he was able to get on board, though, the Cyclopedia didn't succeed in the long term. Partly that was because a lot of other people had the same idea, and partly it was a matter of economics. Dionysus paid his writers well, and the Cyclopedia had a lot of illustrations, which were expensive to produce. But in order to keep it accessible, it was sold at a relatively low price. This made it not very profitable, and that meant he was not able to hire the other high-profile writers he had listed in the initial sales brochure for the Cyclopedia. The last new volume was published in 1841. It was about electricity and magnetism, and was co-authored by Dionysus and Charles Vincent Walker. Walker was a pioneer of telegraphy, and was the first person to send a telegraph from a submarine. Although this was the last new volume published, the books remained in print for another 50 years, and so the publishers probably did make back their investment. And as we will see, there may be other reasons why Dionysus stopped working on the project after 1841. The Cyclopedia wasn't the only book series Dionysus produced. He also created Dr. Lardner's Cabinet Library. This was an annual series detailing new developments in science. It ran from 1830 to 1832. And he even had a separate encyclopedia series running alongside the Cyclopedia, which was called the Edinburgh Cabinet Library. This was a purely geographic encyclopedia, and Lardner was only the editor. He did not write anything for it. It ran from 1830 to 1844. All of this made Dionysus an established figure in the public mind as a learned man, a man of science, a man whose word could be trusted. But that is not the reputation he has today. And all that came down to his most famous rivalry, with a man voted in 2002 as the 2nd greatest Briton in history, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Much like Dionysus, Isambard had been groomed to go into his father's profession. The difference was that Brunel took to this job like a duck to water. His father Mark was French by birth. He was such a noted engineer that when he ran up debts of £5,000, the British government paid them off to stop him emigrating to Russia. Isambard would become so well known that he eclipsed his father, and his independent career began when he was appointed as chief engineer for the Great Western Railway. In this role, he surveyed and designed a railway that ran the width of Britain, from London in the east to Bristol in the west. This route had many engineering innovations on the way, and it was by attacking these innovations that the rivals of the Great Western Railway hoped to bring him down. The person they hired to do it was Dionysus Lardner. Dionysus was hired by the London and Southampton Railway Company, who planned to extend their line to Bristol. This was in competition with the plans of the Great Western. Either scheme would require an Act of Parliament to allow it to go forward, and the government decided to review both at the same time and only pass one of them. Lardner focused his attack on a tunnel that Brunel proposed through a hill near Bath. The hill was called Box Hill, so the tunnel is called the Box Tunnel. The tunnel is nearly 2 miles long, the longest railway tunnel in the world at the time. The geology of the hill led some engineers to say it would be impossible to build. The track running through the tunnel would also have a gradient of 1 in 100, which is extremely steep for a railway track. This was what Dionysus attacked. He claimed that, if the train's carriages broke loose and their brakes failed, they would be travelling at 120 miles per hour when they left the tunnel, an unimaginable speed for the Victorian era. Brunel was quick to discredit this, though. He pointed out that in a tunnel, the resistance of the air would be much greater than on an open track, would have a braking effect on the carriages. They would be travelling at a much slower speed and would not jump the track. He convinced the MPs, and between this and his other sterling evidence, it was the Great Western Railway who received royal assent to build their line. It was a very public humiliation for Dionysus, and it clearly rankled. He tried several times in the following years to get back at Brunel, but only succeeded in humiliating himself further. Brunel had pushed the Great Western Railway Company to open a transatlantic shipping business, as he had the vision of someone buying a single ticket in London that would take them all the way to New York. To do this, he designed a transatlantic steamship, something that had never been done before. Dionysus pored over the plans and was delighted when he thought he'd found a flaw. He scaled up the fuel requirements of modern steamships to the size of the Great Western, and claimed that its maximum range was 2,080 miles, well short of the 3,000-mile journey from Bristol to New York. Once again, Brunel shot him down. What he had realised, and Lardner had not, was that larger ships were actually more fuel efficient compared to the amount they could carry. The water resistance, which drained the fuel, increased based on the width of the hull and the amount of the height that was in the water. The carrying capacity scaled by both those and by the length of the ship. To put it mathematically, the resistance increases by a square ratio and the fuel capacity increases by a cube ratio. His great steamship could carry more than enough fuel. In fact, when it steamed into New York for the first time on the 23rd of April 1838, it had only used 2/3 of the coal on board to fuel the journey. Their last confrontation came that same year, when a group of Great Western Railway shareholders began to have doubts about some of Brunel's decisions. They commissioned John Hawkshaw and Nicholas Wood, two great engineers of the day, to carry out a study. Wood's team included Dionysus, who got to carry out some experiments with their flagship locomotive, the Great Northern. He found some worrying differences between Brunel's claims and the performance of the locomotive, which he decided were due to the air resistance on the broad gauge line. However, in the meeting where the reports were presented, Brunel showed that he had fixed the issue by enlarging the blast pipe of the locomotive. He was able to use this and Dionysus' previous mistakes to throw doubt on the whole report and cover over any valid criticism of his designs. Dionysus became a punchline in the British railway industry, a reputation which haunts him to this day. 1840 was the year that saw what Victorian society considered the greatest scandal of Dionysus Lardner's life, but which I consider possibly his finest hour. By this point, he and Cecilia had divorced. Not a simple matter back then, even when both parties agreed on it. Fault needed to be proven, but him deserting her and moving to London was a reasonably scandal-free reason, without bringing his extramarital affairs, and hers for that matter, into the equation. Marriages had to be dissolved by an Act of Parliament, which took money or connections. Dionysus had connections at least, so in 1839 the Act was passed. Things were not so simple for the new lady in his life, Mary Heaviside. Mary Heaviside was born as Mary Spicer in 1806, child of landed gentry in Somerset. At the age of 18, she was married off to her cousin Richard Heaviside, who was 11 years older. Richard was a military man, thanks to his family buying him an officer's rank in the Dragoon Guards. He was a captain in 1840, although confusingly some records later say that he only reached the rank of lieutenant. These records document his son changing his name to Spicer in 1854. That son was born in 1828 and was preceded by 2 daughters. Richard would later describe himself as a loving husband, though the truth seems to have been quite different. Witnesses later said that it was very rare for Mary to meet anyone or be seen in public without her husband. Through the lens of the time, this was seen as a sign of virtue and of closeness between them. To the modern eye, it looks a lot more like a controlling and toxic relationship. Richard was a violent man with a fiery temper, and it's likely his wife was the target of that temper more than once. Technically, a woman could get a divorce on the grounds of cruelty. In practice, it was extremely unlikely, especially if her husband was determined to prevent her. This is all speculation, of course. The media of the time was thoroughly on Richard's side in the drama to follow, but it's clear that Mary was looking for some way out of her marriage when she met Dionysus Lardner. The pair met around Christmas of 1839, when Dionysus visited Richard Heaviside for dinner. They probably met through railway connections. Captain Heaviside was a director of the Brighton Railway. Exactly how Mary and Dionysus fell in together and planned her escape from her husband is unknown. Dionysus must have known that it would mean the end of his career in England. A wife was the property of her husband under the law, and if he took her away, then he would have been nothing more than a thief in the eyes of the public. But he still decided to do it. On the 11th of March 1840, Richard Heaviside left his house in Brighton to go to London for business. 2 days later, early in the morning, Mary left the house to visit one of her few friends. In truth, she met Dionysus and the pair fled to London, where they stayed in the Adelaide Hotel under the name of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Then they did what most people did when they wanted to get away from London. They moved to Paris. Captain Heaviside was very upset to find his wife had fled, to say the least. Along with Mary's father and another fellow officer, he tracked them down to an apartment in Paris. He beat Dionysus severely with a cane, and then attempted to force his wife to return to England with him. According to some reports, she was actually carried off by her father, but if that did happen, then she was not gone for long. This fresh display of her husband's violent temper did nothing to persuade her to return to him. The men did manage to steal the contents of Dionysus's desk, which they used as evidence against him in a trial for criminal conversation in August. Under English law, this was how men could be sued for adultery, with a disturbing implication that a woman should not speak to a man without her husband's permission. They attempted to show that Dionysus had seduced her, an attempt to get hold of her personal fortune of £20,000. His name was dragged through the mud, and he was fined £8,000. The end result was that Mary was free. Despite efforts by Captain Richard to delay it, their divorce was finalised in 1845. The following year, Mary and Dionysus were officially married. I say officially because the pair had been passing themselves off as married for several years at that point. They'd been able to get away with this because they relocated to America in 1841 and stayed there until the divorce was finalised. They had some initial celebrity in Philadelphia where they stayed. Mostly people were just interested to see Mary. They were disappointed to find out that she was just a normal woman, since many had supposed she must be a beauty. Some newspaper reports say that they actually did get married in 1841, while others say that they could not because the divorce was not final. At least 5 different papers reported that Mary had left Dionysus and that he was starving in Philadelphia. In fact, he did extremely well for himself in America, making around £40,000 from his lectures and work there. Quite a tidy sum for the 1840s. He needed it, as the copyright of his English works had been reassigned to Captain Heaviside, to cover the judgment against Dionysus. But he worked for it too. In 1844, the New York Herald estimated that in the last year he had travelled 10,000 miles and spoke to a combined audience of over 50,000 people across 114 lectures. While he was on this tour, Dionysus did get into one other notable railway-related controversy. On the 2nd of October 1884, a locomotive named the Richmond exploded near Reading, Pennsylvania. 4 people were killed. An inquest on the accident was held to decide if the manufacturers, the Norris brothers, were liable for the explosion. Dionysus was hired by them to investigate. The engine had been in operation for less than 3 weeks, so the supposition was that it was likely to be a mechanical fault. This was supported by the Franklin Institute, whose report claimed to find multiple flaws in the design. Dionysus asserted that the boiler was struck by lightning, and this caused it to overheat beyond the capacity of the safety valves. Witnesses did confirm that there was a severe thunderstorm at the time, to the extent that many people in Reading didn't even notice the explosion. His report was enough to convince the jury, though many since have cried foul play. In particular, modern historians who only know of Dionysus Lardner from his confrontation with Brunel love to imply that he was paid off to bamboozle the jury, even claiming that there was no lightning that day. The Norris brothers did implement some of the safety recommendations of the Franklin Institute afterwards, for whatever that's worth. This profitable series of lectures came to an end in 1845, when a fire at the Provence Theatre in New York destroyed the props Dionysus had been using, which included a planetarium and other pieces. For a few months he continued lecturing, this time telling anecdotes about life in London and Paris. A few months later, the Lardners left America to return to England. They had 2 children by then, one daughter who was born in 1841 and a second who was born after that. Their first stop was London, as either Dionysus or Mary, reports vary, had been summoned to the House of Lords. This was to give evidence about what would happen to Mary's £20,000. By 1846 they had returned to Paris, where Dionysus took a job as the French correspondent for the Daily News, a London newspaper. Dionysus also began writing for the Edinburgh Review again. In 1846 he wrote Railways at Home and Abroad, a thorough survey of railway systems around the world at the time that has been invaluable for modern historians. It was notable for being a lot more pessimistic about the future profit growth of the British railway industry than most of his contemporaries. At the time, speculation on the railways was intense, and his warnings were ignored. History would prove him correct, though, as the bubble burst soon after and cost many their livelihoods. In 1847, Dionysus visited Australia, though he soon returned to Paris. He remained highly respected in the English-speaking world outside of England. His book in 1848 on Euclidean geometry was often cited in discussions, and in the 1850s he edited an American cyclopedia called the Museum of Science and Art. He died in 1859 at the age of 66, around the start of May, probably while holidaying in Naples. Some obituaries say he died in Paris, but then at least one thinks he attended Trinity College in Cambridge, so that's how reliable they tended to be. Some obituaries say he died in Paris, but then at least one of those thinks he attended Trinity College in Cambridge rather than Dublin, so that's how reliable they tended to be. He was buried in the Anglican cemetery in Naples. He was survived by a son from his first marriage, 2 daughters from a second, and of course by his possible illegitimate child Dion, who we may speak about another time. The obituaries described him as someone who had made immeasurable contribution to public education in the sciences. The young man from Dublin, who didn't want to work at his father's law firm, wound up going all round the world, becoming a household name. Nowadays, like most 19th century celebrities, he's been all but forgotten. He's best known as the buffoon in stories of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a corporate shill who couldn't do his sums properly. That's not undeserved, but it's still a bit harsh. Personally, I would like to think of him as someone willing to sacrifice his reputation and livelihood to save the woman he loved from trauma and abuse, and who helped her show that the best revenge was a life lived well. And for that, he has my respect. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.